Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Lidke, and today I am joined by Worshipful Brother Dan Johnson, past master of Southern Lakes and current Grand Orator of the state of Wisconsin. And we're going to be talking about the Cornerstone. Brother Dan, how's it going?
It's great, Chris. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm super excited about talking to you here. One of the great symbols in Freemasonry that has been forgotten, the Cornerstone.
And before we get into that, I have to ask, because we've all wondered at some point, what does the Grand Orator do?
That is a really good question. And so I'll say that it varies from year to year, honestly. One of the things that the Grand Master gets to decide, amongst other things, is what he wants the Grand Orator to do, is what I've discovered. So I think it kind of does vary year to year, depending on the Grand Master's preference. It can vary everything from a Masonic education-based role to more of a public speaking type role, media coordinator type role. It can, have a lot of different phases associated with it. The way I've taken the role is more of an education based. I write an article for the journal, as many of you have probably seen. I go to different lodges when they're having a large ceremonial event, such as a rededication, and speak at those types of events. But it's mostly a public speaking type job / Masonic education based responsibility.
Yeah, it's always been one of those things. They're just some of those Grand Lodge offices that you go, what do they do? So it was a good opportunity to bring that up. So let's talk about the Cornerstone. First of all, what brought you to the Cornerstone? Why that topic?
The interesting thing about the Cornerstone to me is, other than the square and compasses and the holy writings, it's one of the very first symbols that we associate with the Entered Apprentice degree in Freemasonry. And despite the fact that it's one of the very first symbols that we teach in that degree, that's the only time we ever talk about it. Unlike the square and compasses, obviously, which is a couple set of symbols that's pervasive throughout Freemasonry. So I sort of felt like the Cornerstone needed more exploring. And we'll probably have some "Have You Hugged a Cornerstone Yet Today" t-shirts or something printed after this is done, because there's going to be a newfound interest in the Cornerstone, hopefully, here. But the bottom line is, I think it's just a lost symbol in Freemasonry a little bit, but I think it's a very rich symbol that has a lot of different angles to it. So that's why it's interesting to me.
Tell us a little bit about the Cornerstone as you understand it.
Yeah, so as I said, we're taught really early on in our Masonic career or our Masonic journey that the Cornerstone is important. Number one, we're taught that when you stand in that northeast corner, this is the first step in essentially your Masonic journey. Now, when you look at a lot of the different commentators out there in Masonic circles that talk about the Cornerstone or why that standing in the northeast corner is important, a lot of them talk about this transition from the darkness of the world to the light of Freemasonry. Now, if you think about it, that's talked about a couple different places in the Entered Apprentice degree. So we talk about there being no lights in the north of the lodge, and the north being a place of darkness. We're given an explanation of that. So you have the north part of the northeast, and then we talk about the east as the source of light. So you have the east being the light source. So when you think about the northeast corner, you have that perfect connection or transition from the darkness to the light. So the Cornerstone is really important in your Masonic journey as a first step, because it's your first step from that darkness into that light. So when you talk about what symbolically does the Cornerstone mean, a lot of the commentators talk about that, and I think that just makes a lot of sense about that ultimate transition, and that being the intersection of the darkness and the light.
Yeah, it's the first time that I've come across, that might be the second time that I've come across that interpretation. And it's really interesting because it's more about the placement than it is about the thing, the cornerstone itself, which makes it rather interesting because I can't think of anything else in masonry where we really have that moment, that place, other than arguably during a degree, but we won't dig into that too much.
Right. And that's one of the most interesting things about the cornerstone, too, because you have the physical aspect of what a cornerstone is, that stone on the side of the building that has some writing on it that we all know and love. And then you have this symbol of standing in the northeast corner as the cornerstone location in your journey to Freemasonry. So it's one of those rare symbols that has both a physical aspect to it and a completely abstract aspect to it as well, which is sort of interesting and makes it, I think, a little unique.
And so, you put in the northeast corner, there's obviously a lesson to that. How does it relate to, let's relate it to the cornerstone before we really dig into what that lesson is. So what can you tell us about the cornerstone itself?
Right. So when you talk about the cornerstone from an operative masonry standpoint, there's some practical importance to the cornerstone right off the bat. So being the first stone laid in a building, it's critical that that cornerstone be both level and square because all the stones around it are being built based on that first stone. If that cornerstone is off in any way, it sets the whole rest of the building out of kilter. So from an operative masonry standpoint, the cornerstone ends up being a pretty critical part. So in the laying of the cornerstone itself, because it's a critical part, historically, there was a ceremony or celebration associated with the cornerstone. Now, the celebration associated with the cornerstone would vary depending on the time period and history that you're talking about. But I look at it as sort of a celebration of new beginnings. When you have a new building that's being erected, and you have a building that's important enough to actually have a cornerstone in it, because keep in mind, while all buildings have a northeast corner, not all buildings have a cornerstone. In the traditional sense that we're talking about, where it's an ornate thing associated with the building. So when you have this new building created and completed, the community has an expectation that this building will be of significance, generally speaking. It will be a hospital. It will be a courthouse. It will be a fire station. It will be something that's going to overall help the community in some tangible way. And so the laying of that initial cornerstone, yeah, go ahead.
What I was going to get into or ask you about is, the cornerstone, of course, is the first stone that's laid, as you said. But what is its function? What is its role in the building architecturally?
Well, I think you have a couple different things. I mentioned kind of setting up the rest of the building, that part of it.
Right.
The other part is a lot of times you can look at a cornerstone as a time capsule. Many lodges, for instance, use their cornerstone as a way of memorializing in multiple different ways the creation of that building, whether it be through the plaque on the front of the building or a time capsule inside of it. So I think, when you look at the function of what a cornerstone's purpose is, it has a practical purpose in the sense that the building is started there, but then it also has more of a ceremonial importance. So people later on can look back at that cornerstone and know when the building was created and what may have been going on in the world at that time, and have more of a historical context of the building itself.
Yeah, from an architectural perspective, and this is again more on that operative side, my understanding is the cornerstone originally, going back to ancient times, would have been laid as a point of reference, as here is the basis from which we work. The stone has to be level because all other stones will be leveled against it. It has to be perpendicular because all other stones will be, laid properly straight based on that cornerstone. Is that something you came across?
Right. We were talking a little bit about that earlier with it being both level and square. If it isn't, then, the whole building is off kilter. And especially in ancient times, this was a well-known thing. Ceremonies were conducted on the cornerstone. There were sacrifices made on the cornerstone. Everybody realized that this laying of the cornerstone was the critical moment for this building. And he was either going to go forward appropriately or it was going to go forward not much appropriately at all. And so this was an important event, and hence all the pomp and circumstance associated with it.
Not that we do any of that today as Masons, right?
Well, it's amazing how much pomp and circumstance there is in Freemasonry sometimes, for sure, but for good reason. These lodge buildings that are created, you have to look at it from the perspective of not just that one day, that is the dedication of the cornerstone or the building. You have to look at it also from all the work that went into just getting to the point of having a cornerstone in the first place. So when we're talking about this celebration of laying the cornerstone, you think about the fact that the ground needed to be cleared, architectural plans needed to be developed, meetings needed to be had to finalize those plans. All these things that had to come to fruition before you even get to the point of the cornerstone. In some ways, the laying of the cornerstone is the easy part. It's just the fruit of everyone's labor to get to that point, which I think is why it's a really important symbol and why we celebrate it so much.
And what do we do as Masons at a cornerstone laying for those people who may have never seen this since we're still on the operative side?
Well, there's a whole ceremony that goes into the laying of a cornerstone, and generally you'll have an important Masonic figure preside over that. It could be as high up as the Grand Master or someone lower than that. But when you look at the ceremony, it's a dedication. You're dedicating not just the cornerstone, you're dedicating the building in general. You're having an eye towards the future during this ceremony. By laying the cornerstone, this is what we hope to accomplish in Freemasonry with this building. And that first cornerstone being of stone of particular importance is the ceremonial getting this thing off on the right foot sort of an event. So it's really important to have some ceremony behind it, but also some forward thinking associated with it so that we are not only worried about the cornerstone itself, but just what's going to happen with this building in general.
Yeah, so it's a ceremony of auspicious beginning. Really,
I really think so, and it's like I said, it's evolved over the course of time. It used to be a very solemn situation, like I said, with sacrifices and other things being made on the cornerstone because of how critical it was. Maybe now it would be described as a more joyous occasion. But yeah, no, it's critical. And like I said, I think when you look at why it's important, you really have to look at all the work that went into it ahead of time to get to the point of even, laying the cornerstone itself.
So it's sort of like taking that good man, making him better. He has to be good first, which brings us to the speculative side. How do we start to apply this in Masonry?
Right. So one of the wonderful things about the cornerstone, of course, is that you have the physical stone and then you have kind of the abstract aspect. By bringing a candidate into a lodge and handing you, as a candidate, your metaphorical working tools, the brethren of the lodge are putting their trust in you. They're saying that we vetted you. We think you're a good person. We think you belong here. And we want you to now earn our trust even further by living a good life. And the cornerstone is very similar to that. If you look at what a cornerstone is, it's not something that's hidden in the back of the building somewhere on the back part where no one can see it. It's out in front, much like we expect Freemasons to be out front in their communities. We expect Masons to be leaders in their communities, not hidden away somewhere. The cornerstone is the stone, as we talked about, that supports the other stones around us. It's not a stone at the top of the building with no one worrying about it. It's the stone that all the others around it are relying on. Much like Freemasonry, we are expected to be people that others can rely on. We're expected to be trustworthy. We're expected to help when help is needed. In a way, the cornerstone, by setting the example for the other stones to follow and being level and square, is the same expectation we have of a Freemason, that he will ultimately live a life that can be an example for others by being on the level and being square in his moral continence. So I think we can, in fact, extrapolate a little bit from the actual physical cornerstone itself to then turning that into a symbol that we can use in Freemasonry as a way of explaining different tangible concepts to a new Mason about how to live a just and upright life. I think one of the nice things about the cornerstone and just our use of symbolism in general as Freemasonry is exactly that connection that I was just talking about. There's nothing in our ritual anywhere that teaches what I just explained, but I think it's a logical connection when you look at all the different information that we're given and look at it as a totality. And that's what symbolism really helps out with, is that I can take a symbol and read something into it that someone else may not see. They may see something different, and we both might be right, but we can use those symbols in a way that helps us on our own Masonic journey, live our life in a Masonic way with the broad overall teachings of friendship, morality, and brotherly love.
And so you see the cornerstone as, I'm just trying to clarify here, as really not only a foundational point, but a lesson of leadership, a lesson of becoming someone that others will eventually look up to, or hopefully look up to at that point. Is that right? Or am I off a little bit here?
Right. I think that's right. You know, we talked earlier about this transition from darkness to light, being part of the cornerstone symbolism. So you have an individual who's been in the metaphorical darkness of the world. We place them in the northeast corner. We expect that as part of standing in the northeast corner, they're going to be starting to make that transition into the light. So what does that mean? What that means is that you'll start living from that moment forward in a Masonic way with the help of the lodge. We're going to teach you some things along the way. We're going to give you some more lessons along the way. And we're expecting you to be one of us. We're expecting you to be a moral and upright man. We're expecting you to be a cornerstone in your own personal familial life, in your work life, in the other people that you touch. Be the cornerstone, be the example. And I think with that being the first step in Freemasonry, that's why I think this dovetails so nicely with the cornerstone.
And how does it square with the idea of the rough ashlar? I mean, if we're coming in as a rough ashlar, but now we're being represented as a cornerstone, which is perfected, how do these two ideas go together? Or is this another example of Masonic cognitive dissonance?
No, I think they're they're concepts that fit hand in glove with each other to me. If you go to a lodge and they have an example of a rough ashlar and a perfect ashlar, maybe up in the east or somewhere else in the lodge, to me, when I look at that perfect ashlar, I'm looking at what appears to be a cornerstone. That's what a cornerstone would look like in a building if it was taken out and just put in its own space. Now, as a rough ashlar, that sort of represents that darkness, that transition from darkness. If you want to say that we're rough around the edges in that darkness of the world before we come into Freemasonry, we're coming in as that rough ashlar. We're coming in from that place of darkness. And then over the course of time through these Masonic lessons, the ultimate expectation is, or hope is, that we'll end up being that perfect ashlar. Now that northeast corner is that transition point.
And are we then, so basically, are we the cornerstone or are we standing on the cornerstone?
I think it's both. I mean, I think that's the wonderful thing about the symbol. I think that it has an expectation that you will be a cornerstone metaphorically, so that when you are, in fact, have become the perfect ashlar, you will be in a position to be the example for the other stones around you. This is what we expect a finished stone to look like. This is what our expectation is for how a finished stone will fit into the building and interact with the other stones. But I think you're also standing in that point where the operative mason would put his cornerstone as a way of new beginnings, as a way of starting a new journey. So you have both the physical location, which is the start of the journey, but then we also have the physical aspect of the cornerstone, which is what we hope you will eventually become, that perfect ashlar or that cornerstone.
All right. And now the cornerstone, of course, there's a lot of planning that goes in as you're laying the cornerstone, thinking about that from an operative perspective. Does that come into the lessons on the speculative side as well?
I think so. No one is going to be a good person unless you probably first have a good heart. You have sort of a starting point. But I really believe that when we're talking about self-improvement, which is what we really teach in Freemasonry, whether it be with the liberal arts and sciences or other lessons that we learn, the expectation is that we won't place you in the northeast corner. We're all going to snap our fingers and you'll instantly become this Renaissance man that's capable of doing everything from a self-improvement perspective that we expect.
I thought that's what happened when we stand up from the altar.
Right. I mean, unfortunately, it's not that easy, right? Being a well-rounded person, being a good person takes a lot of work. It's not easy. It takes some self-reflection. It takes some education. It takes talking to your peers and getting different perspectives maybe than your own perspective on things. There's this whole process. To me, it's a crucible that we put ourselves in that helps refine us into the good person, the good Freemason that we hope to be at the end of our journey when we end up becoming that perfect ashlar. And I think where some people make a misstep along their Masonic journey and then we never see them again is they have that expectation that I'll go through my first degree or maybe even all the way through my third degree, and then something magical will happen, and I'll suddenly become this perfect ashlar. And I think just like anything else in life, becoming a perfect ashlar, becoming a cornerstone that other stones want to follow takes some work, takes some self-improvement.
And how would you connect the cornerstone, these ideas, to the tools that they would have more or less just received? These ideas of the, and now I'm blanking on the tools of the entered apprentice, the gavel and the 24-inch gauge.
Sure. The common gavel is an incredibly important tool in the first steps of refining a rough ashlar into a perfect ashlar. So we've put you in the northeast corner. We've described the rough ashlar and the perfect ashlar to you, so you have an idea of what the journey is going to look like, what we're hoping that you become. And then we're giving you the physical tool, the common gavel, to ultimately help that process, that transition process unfold by knocking off the corners of rough stones and helping them to better fit for the builder's use in that particular location where that stone will be going. So I think there's a lot of synergy in that first degree when you talk about the different symbols and then taking a more broad view and how they all tie together. They're not independent entities. There's very much a tie-in amongst all of them, I believe.
And so how can I or any Mason or any of our 7 listeners here make use of the lesson of the cornerstone? Where's the practical application in day-to-day life?
To me, I think the first thing is where this is helpful is actually in talking to a brand new entered apprentice right off the bat about what the expectations are. I think the discussion that we've been having here today about how the cornerstone is important is a discussion that you can physically give to an new entered apprentice about kind of what the expectations are. And the nice thing about it, I think, is that before we were all Freemasons, we knew what a cornerstone was. It's a symbol we had heard of. It's a symbol that we've seen on a maybe even a daily basis. We all know what it is. And so when you're now taking a symbol which is not esoteric, it's not something no one's ever heard of, it's a tangible thing in their mind, and then you teach them how that symbol is now important in a different way in their transition to Freemasonry. I think you can really pick up steam with a new person and explain to them using something they're already aware of to teach that new lesson. Sometimes with these more esoteric symbols in Freemasonry, you can watch the entered apprentice's eyes glaze over as you're trying to talk to them about this symbol. They have no idea, what the circle with the point inside of it is. You're explaining it to them, but it's going over their head initially because they've never heard of it before. So
Well, then there's a million things going on at the time too,
right, exactly. But I think, after the degree is over and you're downstairs in the basement of your lodge or in the kitchen area of your lodge eating cookies and cake and celebrating that first degree with that new Mason, I think this is where that conversation can then pick up about, now we just described to you what the Cornerstone is, and here's kind of how that's relevant and what we're hoping happens in your life from a change standpoint using this. So I think the answer to your question is that it's incredibly helpful to a new Mason. Second thing is that sometimes in the busyness of life, we just run out of time for self-improvement. We run out of time for self-reflection because we're going and going and going. And I think as you're walking by the front door of your lodge and you see the Cornerstone there, as you're walking by the bank that you do business in and you see a Cornerstone there, because it's so omnipresent as a symbol, and if we start to understand why a Cornerstone matters, though there are countless opportunities in day-to-day life to remember the ultimate goals of Freemasonry of self-improvement. So I think you have two aspects to it. It can help a brand new Master Mason in giving them a tangible object in their discussion of symbolism. And then a more seasoned Master Mason can use it as an everyday object that comes to mind in our lives as a way of reminding us of that continual journey of self-improvement and being the model for others to follow that we were supposed to be following.
And there's something, so in September of 2023, you wrote an article about the Cornerstone, and I'm going to put you in the awkward point or awkward situation, that's what I'm looking for, of quoting yourself back to yourself.
Yeah.
But you say in the last paragraph, the stones above and around you are relying on you for support. This idea of the Mason as Cornerstone, can you expand on that beyond simply the, sort of community leader idea?
This really gets into the brotherly love aspect to me. There's an expectation in our fraternity that we won't just come to lodge and do a degree every now and then, but off the clock, we're going to help each other out. We're going to be supportive of another Freemason. We're going to be supportive of their widow once they're gone. We're going to be supportive of their children once they're gone. So there's an expectation that if you think of the lodge itself as a perfect pile of perfect ashlars, all these stones have an expectation that the stones around them are going to be supporting them, are going to be helping them. And that cornerstone is the foundational piece. It's the first piece that has, to me, the most value in helping the other Masons around them. So when you talk about cornerstones being rock solid, they have to be, because all the stones above them it's bearing their weight. When you talk about them supporting others, they have to, because otherwise the building is going to crumble. So there has to be level, it has to be square, it has to be solid. And there's an expectation that as a cornerstone, you'll be able to handle that weight.
All right. So is there anything, getting into sort of a nuanced corner, I do this with everyone who comes on. if I give you a couple of minutes, is there anything that we haven't covered here with the Cornerstone, or any bit that you want to get out there to the listeners?
I think the thing I'd emphasize the most is that sometimes when we talk about these symbols and we do a deep dive into them, sometimes someone may come to the conclusion, well, you're extrapolating too much. You're just sort of making things up when you talk about what different aspects of the Cornerstone exist. And I think that, these are my interpretations of it, and I think they're grounded in our ritual. But I think, as I had said earlier, the nice thing about symbolism as a teaching tool is it gives you some creative license. It gives you some flexibility to see different things in these symbols and create a different moral lesson for yourself out of them. So I think what I would encourage people the most is not just with the Cornerstone, but with the symbols that we have in general. Obviously, read the ritual. Do your own research if you are excited about that, like I am, and learn more, but also come to your own independent conclusions about what that symbol means for you, because the Cornerstone may mean something for me, but it may mean something different for you. And what I've tried to do here today is to throw out a lot of different angles of what the Cornerstone may mean as a symbol. All of which come at it from a different angle, because I think it's a rich symbol that has a lot of different aspects to it that are important. But I think the most important part of it is just remembering that there's an expectation that as a Freemason, you're the benchmark in your community. You're the cornerstone. You're going to act and conduct yourself in a way that's an example for others. And by laying of that cornerstone just level and just square and having all the other stones follow its example, it's a perfect allegory to what our expectations are of you as a new entered apprentice as you're starting your Masonic journey.
I have to say, Dan, really, you did not hear the conversation, because at the time we're recording this, my conversation with Worshipful Brother Pat Choka has not gone out. And I find it interesting that you both went in the same direction, different topics, but both talking about the idea of everyone having their own interpretation, of being able to look at these ideas and understand them in different ways. These idea that we're kind of starting a conversation rather than ending it. And so I just find it interesting that we all find ourselves on the same page in this area, even when we have no idea that someone else feels that way. And maybe you've talked to Pat in the past and have the same idea, but I just found it rather interesting.
I think what that means to me, I think that's a key point. So I'll stop right there and say this is a key point, because that's the whole point of Freemasonry in some ways. There are some nebulous parts of it. We don't say that this is the law when it comes to our ritual, and the only interpretation of the cornerstone is that you're standing in the northeast corner of it, and you're not allowed to in a different way. We're prohibiting you from doing that. There's an expectation of Freemasonry that Freemason will change your life in a way that you need it changed. And that may be different for Chris Ludke than it is for Dan Johnson. And by giving us some wiggle room, giving us some creative license with these symbols, and by having more broad interpretations of them that are capable of having some nuance, it really allows us as individuals to get something different out of it than somebody else, which I think is wonderful.
Fantastic. Brother Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Chris. It's been a lot of fun sitting and talking with you today.
And for the listeners, thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Lidke, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.